So if anybody, um, um, yeah, is just concerned about that, you can always take your video off and change your name to a food or something like that if you'd like to remain anonymous. And I imagine it only has my video on the recording. All right, so let's get going. So with inflammation and gut health, I'd love to just hear if there's any areas that anyone's really interested in or really hoping that we'll talk about tonight. Feel free to just throw them in the chat if anything comes to mind, and fine if nothing does, but always interested to just hear what kind of grabs somebody's attention when they hear a topic like this, and if there's something you're really hoping to learn more about. So give you so many conflicting stories about dairy, gluten. Yes. So many conflicting things, isn't there? So we'll definitely talk about that a little bit today. What kind of foods may cause inflammation and why sensitivities and intolerances diminish or increase over time. That's a great question. We'll definitely look at that as well. It's a really interesting one. So these are great. If anything else comes to mind, please feel free to put them in the chat. Just want to make sure I can link those in as we chat tonight. Okay, so the objectives for tonight, I hope you come away with an understanding of the role of inflammation in the body, acute versus chronic, and what that means. And that recognizing factors that influence inflammation and why that might be, why that causes an inflammatory response in the body. We'll certainly dive into the nutrition side about those anti-inflammatory foods as well as pro-inflammatory foods. And then we'll chat about the role of our gut microbiome and that relationship with inflammation. And then my hope is that you come away with a lot of practical nutrition strategies to support that gut health and support reducing inflammation. Okay, so what is inflammation? So inflammation, it's a response. It's a really important response in the body, response of our immune system to defend the body from injury. It's protective and it helps eliminate destructive agents, so helping to heal damaged tissue. So if we think about training and competition demands on the body, it causes damage to the cells, and then we have that inflammatory response to help with that healing. So it's a normal part of a post-training response, and we need it to help athlete or anyone really to adapt to a training stimuli. So we think of acute inflammation, it's a short-term reaction of the immune system. So again, if there's an irritant or an infection or an injury, the body's going to send that immediate release of kind of helper cells to go to that site. It's a normal response, protective and beneficial, and really to help rebuild and the healing of tissues. So blood rushes to those affected body parts and delivers nutrients and platelets and white blood cells and all these other factors to just help support that healing process. So thinking, redness, warmth, swelling, if you've got like a cut or something like that, you'll notice that response and it occurs quite quickly. Chronic inflammation, on the other hand, is a longer-term ongoing state where the immune system remains activated. So acute, as quickly as that response is, it'll also go away once it's done its job, where chronic inflammation is going to remain. And it represents some dysregulation. There's something going on there that why it hasn't sort of ended. And it can result in some cellular and tissue damage. So it's not a natural part of the healing process, plays a really big role in chronic diseases. And because these sort of white blood cells and the messengers continue to be released and it's prolonged, that's where it ends up with some of that damage to healthy tissues. So an analogy I really like, and this is from a dietitian, Jean LaMantia. She does a lot of work in inflammation and cancer research. And it's a really great analogy. So if you think about, at your house and you look out the window and say there's a car accident. So we've got the first responders are coming in, maybe someone called 911, here comes an ambulance, fire truck, and then a cleanup crew, maybe the tow truck to pull a car away. And then once it's dealt with and everyone's safe, and then off the responders go, and then the street goes back to normal. Chronic inflammation, on the other hand, is say you've got that same accident, the fire truck comes and police cars come, the first responders come, and people are kind of, looking to see what happened. And then nobody leaves. So everything kind of stays there. And then the next day is typically garbage day on your street. And you bring your garbage cans out, but the garbage trucks can't get through and the recycling trucks can't get through. And this congestion's building and building, and it's impairing what would typically be very normal everyday processes. So it's kind of just an example of comparing that acute to chronic inflammation. So chronic inflammation can lead to a number of different things. If we think kind of highlighted in blue here, sort of sport specific, impairing recovery, can have impacts on sport performance, due to that impaired recovery and fatigue, and can cause a lot of gastrointestinal issues. So gas, bloating, constipation, like I mentioned, can lead to a lot of different chronic diseases. Often chronic inflammation can manifest in sort of skin conditions, such as acne or eczema and rosacea, lead to metabolic disorders, autoimmune disorders, and can certainly compromise the immune system. So it certainly plays a big role in a lot of different things. So we're going to look a little bit at factors that influence inflammation. So we'll talk about physical activity and sports, and dive into nutrition-related factors. And we'll look at cortisol and stress regulation, and then kind of that gut health and the imbalance in gut flora. So we'll look at those top four in detail, but there are lots of others as well that can influence inflammation in the body. So environmental factors like pollutants, chronic infections, certainly lack of sleep, and especially chronic lack of sleep, allergenic foods, and that's, we can touch on that, especially with the question around gluten and dairy and things like that. Smoking, and then I think this one's really interesting at the bottom with social disconnection, especially if we think during COVID times and the impact something like that can have on people, and just kind of having a bit of a stressful inflammatory response. So a number of different factors here. And so we'll look at these kind of top four in a bit more detail. So physical activity or exercise and sport demands, it's an acute stressor on the body and will prompt that acute inflammation to support that recovery. So it's really how we adapt to a stimulus. So regular physical activity, although it prompts that acute inflammation response, long-term is associated with lower levels of inflammation. And being completely physically inactive is associated with chronic low-grade inflammation. So it just really highlights the important role of physical activity and being active and promoting that anti-inflammatory state. However, certainly chronic overexercising, if we're not allowing for that recovery, can lead to chronic inflammation if we're just not giving the body kind of that time to adapt, or the nutrition to support it. So C-reactive protein, shortened to CRP, it's an inflammatory marker, and it drastically increases post-exercise, but returns to baseline levels within 48 hours to a few days. And of course, this depends on the sport, the activity, and the demands of it. But it just really highlights the importance of recovery measures. So to help the body kind of return to that homeostasis and that baseline levels. So supporting it with nutrition and rest and hydration, to help the body with that process. So in terms of some nutrition related factors that we're going to look at, so we'll talk about essential fatty acids, blood sugar balance, and then some pro-inflammatory foods in detail. And there will be, so I think we've got a few biochemistry people on here, so that's great. So we'll look a little bit at that because it helps to kind of show why some foods might lead to more inflammation versus others. So essential fatty acids, we've got, I've just got two here, but there are others as well. So the omega-6 fats and the omega-3 fats. So omega-6 fats tend to be pro-inflammatory, and we will look at this in more detail in the next slide, but just some things like sunflower oil, safflower oils, corn, cottonseed, soybean oil. And then on the other side here on the right, we've got the omega-3 fats, which lend themselves to being anti-inflammatory, things like fatty fish, walnuts, flax, chia seeds. And what we're looking at with these is the ratio. So it's not, as we've seen with the discussion between acute inflammation and chronic, inflammation is important. We do need that process. So we do need the omega-6 fats and we need that pathway, but it's the ratio that sometimes can get out of whack. And in a typical kind of Western diet, often the ratio of omega-6 fats to omega-3 fats could be 20 to 1, 40 to 1 in for omega-6 compared to omega-3. And research has shown that a ratio even just as 10 to 1 can promote a sort of pro-inflammatory state. So we're aiming for about a 4 to 1 or 6 to 1 in terms of omega-6 to omega-3 for that ratio to just help tip the scales a little bit. So just to kind of highlight, so again, the omega-6 and omega-3, they're polyunsaturated fats. And this particular chart, and this is not an extensive list of all sources, it's just highlighting a few sort of oils and foods. But the omega-3 here is in that turquoise. And the omega-6 in purple. So you can see a lot of things are primarily the omega-6, or certainly have a lot more of the omega-6 ratio to the omega-3, with the exception of the two that I highlighted here with the flaxseed oil and salmon. So showing kind of foods like these, how they can really help shift that ratio a little bit. Okay, and I meant to mention, so the omega-6 and omega-3 is just referring to where that double bond is on the carbon chain. So with omega-6 is the double bonds on the 6 carbon and from the end, and the omega-3 is on the 3rd carbon from the end. So if we look on the left here with the omega-6 fatty acids, and we take linoleic acid here, so an omega-6 fatty acid that serves as it's a precursor for a number of pro-inflammatory molecules that get released from this arachidonic acid that I circled here in red. And so this is kind of the pathway that it will go through to promote that pro-inflammatory state. So having a high consumption in a lot of these foods that contain that linoleic acid can lend itself to kind of promoting or higher propensity for a pro-inflammatory state in the body. And then I'll also just mention, so arachidonic acid also found in things like meat and poultry and eggs. And then if we look on the other side here with the omega-3 fatty acids, so starting at the top with the alpha linolenic acid. So this is found in green leafy vegetables, flax, chia seeds, walnuts, and this can help promote an anti-inflammatory pathway in a few ways. So we're not going to get into all the enzymes and which ones are kind of impacting them, but the ALA and the omega-3 fatty acids help decrease the production of that arachidonic acid. And they also contribute to the anti-inflammatory pathway by, of course, producing or contributing to these molecules. They're precursors for the anti-inflammatory molecules at the bottom here, the prostaglandins and the thromboxans. And when we so I've circled here the EPA and the DHA and the arachidonic acid. So when the arachidonic acid's produced, EPA and DHA can also compete with it within cell membranes, within that phospholipid bilayer. So that's another way it can also promote that anti-inflammatory environment, because if we have more production of EPA and more DHA, they can take up more space in those cells essentially, and then that will also help with that anti-inflammatory pathway in the body. So with EPA and DHA, you'd find these in things like oily fish, also in krill oil or algae oil. And ALA can be converted into EPA and DHA, but it just, not all of it is converted. So it's a better source when it's found in things like fish or the algae oil. So wanted to just show these pathways because we'll talk, the arachidonic acid will come up again, and EPA and DHA will come up again. And you might have heard of the EPA and DHA as being anti-inflammatory. So if somebody was having like an omega-3 supplement, usually it's consisting of both of those in there to support, again, that anti-inflammatory pathway. So we'll kind of refer to some of these words as we go.
Alison, do you mind if I ask, is there any benefits to the arachidonic acid?
Yeah, great question. So yes, because we still, of course, need sometimes acute inflammation, and inflammation when it's serving as a healthy process in the body. So yes, we still need it. It's still something that has an important role. But what we are trying to shift away from is having that as the predominant pathway that's always producing these pro-inflammatory markers. But yeah, there's certainly times that we will need that inflammation, and we need that release of those, and we need that arachidonic acid to help with those kind of signaling molecules.
Right, thank you.
All right, yeah, great question. So if we look at blood sugar balance, so in terms of with blood sugar balance, we talked about the role of insulin and with glucagon. If somebody has a regular consumption, so a chronic consumption of high glycemic load, refined carbohydrate foods, this can result in those chronically elevated blood sugar levels, and then, of course, subsequently insulin levels. So as we mentioned, insulin is that hormone required to help bring that glucose up into that cell. So we absolutely need it, plays a really important role. Where challenges start to come in is if we have chronically high levels of blood sugars, high levels of insulin, and leading to that insulin resistance. And now our body needs to produce more and more insulin to have the same response. And the more, so it's kind of a cascade of different things, or of a few things. So we've got the high blood sugars, the high insulin, now the insulin resistance, needing more insulin. And this is leading to that increased production of free radicals and pro-inflammatory molecules. So again, that greater insulin response results in more of that arachidonic acid, and then it's more pro-inflammatory. So we absolutely need insulin. We need it to get that glucose out of our blood and up into our cells. So this is referring to when it becomes really chronically high levels and really sustained high levels, leading to that insulin resistance. And it's just kind of an overboard, too much. So we talked about the role of the fatty acids and the blood sugar management. So a few additional kind of pro-inflammatory foods, and again, a lot of them work in that kind of similar fashion with the two areas we just talked about. So foods that contain trans fats, so it's found in small amounts in meat and dairy, but primarily in foods prepared with hydrogenated vegetable oils like baked goods. And the consumption of trans fatty acids has been linked and associated with systemic inflammation and ongoing. In BC and Canada a number of years ago, it was banned the use of trans fats in restaurants. So they're certainly not as prevalent as they used to be. I imagine more with baked goods and in the US. I don't know what their regulations are, but I imagine there's a lot more of that, but we don't have a lot in our foods in Canada with those regulations. Other pro-inflammatory foods, so deep fried foods, high saturated fat foods, and again, related to the different pathways similar to with the fats that we talked about. The really refined high glycemic load carbohydrates, like we mentioned, because of that role with blood sugars, tropical oils, and then again, foods quite high in sugar. So we'll come back to kind of look at the nutrition on the flip side and what's anti-inflammatory, but just touch on cortisol as well. So a stress hormone released by the adrenal glands. So acute stress regulates inflammation. So really beneficial. Acute stress, it's good. We need it. Having stressors on the body, important for prompting growth and building strength. Similar to the difference with acute inflammation and chronic is now if we get into chronic stress, that becomes quite pro-inflammatory. So high levels of cortisol chronically, similar to what mentioned with insulin resistance, is now there's resistance to that cortisol binding. And now you need even higher levels of cortisol to have the same effect. So cortisol has pro-inflammatory effects. And again, as acute is really important. So those release of mast cells, which are those immune cells that kind of release a number of other cells that support that inflammatory process, the release of histamine, for example. And histamine we'll really look at when we talk about in the gut. And I think there was one of the comment someone said about sensitivities and intolerances. Yeah, so that comes up too when we'll look at this in a bit more detail when we look at the gut side of things, because the release of histamine has an impact on blood vessels, helps to dilate them so that we can have a rush of those nutrients that we need as that inflammatory response. And it also makes them a bit like leakier so that again, we can get those different molecules and nutrients that we need to go through. But this, of course, if it's over a long term, can start to have some negative impacts. All right, so nutrition patterns to reduce inflammation. So we saw that there's a few nutrition related things that contribute to it, but there's strong evidence to support that an anti-inflammatory eating pattern can reduce inflammation and via those C-reactive protein markers in this particular review study. But I think I really like to stress that it's the eating pattern. So certainly some of the foods that may be pro-inflammatory are going to they fit into our overall eating patterns at some point. But it's if they become the full bulk of those foods that's where it can become a bit problematic. So it's an overall eating pattern that can reduce inflammation. And what does that look like? So it's been shown to be primarily plant-based, and this isn't to mean vegan. This isn't a strong label. It just means having the bulk with lots of plant-based foods. So lots of vegetables and whole grains and beans and lentils and seeds and nuts and things like that as the bulk or the majority. High in fruits and vegetables, low in red meat. So still they found lean meats in there and fish. And the Mediterranean diet is also been shown to be quite anti-inflammatory, with a lot of the fats coming from things like olives and olive oil and fatty fish. Again, a lot of fruits and vegetables making up the bulk there, on whole grains. Other kind of patterns, again, generally low glycemic carbohydrate foods, just really high fiber foods, and then foods that have a lot of the polyphenols. So these are the plant-based phytochemicals, again, found in things like flax and beans and other seeds and things like that. So those are kind of the patterns, but if we look at some specific anti-inflammatory foods, and we think in the context of what we just looked at for nutrition factors that can cause inflammation. So whole grains, high fiber foods, things that reducing those refined carbohydrates, because these high fiber foods are going to help with that blood sugar balance. So beans and lentils and legumes, a high consumption of vegetables, and again, really looking for diversity. And the different kind of families of vegetables are cruciferous, so like broccoli and cauliflower, those types of ones, the leafy greens with the spinach and kale and collard greens and bok choy, the ones that have a lot of the carotenoids, the colorful ones, carrots and peppers. So looking at that diversity and the variety of colors. Plant sources of protein, again, found to be quite anti-inflammatory. So those nuts and legumes, soy seeds, lean animal meats, and then fish as well. We talked about olive oil and the omega-3 fats. So again, going back to that pathway. So the chia seeds, flax, green leafy vegetables, hemp hearts, walnuts, all a source of that ALA. And then the fatty fish is going to be a source of the EPA and DHA. And a lot of spices. So And on the, like I mentioned about the second half of the presentation, really looking at some practical tips. And so we'll look at that. How can we, incorporate these in different spices with turmeric and garlic and ginger and rosemary and thyme and all these kind of different wonderful flavorings. And just a note about the spices, and I see this a lot. Often when we see that something has a positive property to it, scientists love to kind of bottle it up into a supplement form. So we hear about turmeric going into kind of a supplement form, but really what we see with the research is the beneficial effects come from eating it in combination with other foods and working kind of synergistically with other foods. And there's going to be things that kind of help with the absorption of a lot of these things. So turmeric as an example, with kind of black pepper as one example. So having the spices, it's just kind of a like to have it in the whole food form. We can get kind of sucked into a lot of these supplements and the strong marketing, but really having it in the food form shows to have the most kind of benefits. Yeah, so just a good question that just came in there. So maybe I'll touch on that here. Is saying, if iron deficient, would red meat be a good source? Yeah, and this is one of those great questions that it's not a straightforward answer because of the individual. So I would look at what are their iron markers. How is the ferritin, the hemoglobin, the hematocrit, the demands of the particular person in terms of physical activity and things like that. And look at their overall eating pattern, and then would see if is red meat a good source? Is it better for this person to try and get it from other food sources, or is a supplement warranted? So I don't have a straightforward answer for it. That's one of those things that really, through kind of talking to the person, would figure out if that's the best option. But in terms of iron source, red meat it does have a good source of iron in it, and it's a heme iron, so we're able to absorb it quite well. Another interesting part about an anti-inflammatory food pattern and way of eating is that it really encourages mindful eating and quality over quantity. And I think the mindful eating piece really links into a few things. It allows us to tap back into kind of our own intuition around foods and listening to those hunger signals. And just enjoying that food. And also when we eat mindfully, I imagine it's not as stressful as maybe I know that there's times where we're all eating on the go and we're rapidly driving from one place to the next. But getting back to that mindful eating, I do think has a lot of benefits, and certainly part of that anti-inflammatory pattern. And then seasonal foods when able, but not to shy away from frozen. Frozen foods are they're frozen at peak ripeness, so they often have really good nutritional value and are a great option in the wintertime when it can be really challenging to get those seasonal foods. But still, when able, trying to get some of those in there. So that's kind of a snapshot of some anti-inflammatory foods, and we'll visit those again later in the practical nutrition strategies. Okay, so let's look a little bit at the relationship with kind of our gut and inflammation. So we have this microbiome in our body, which basically is all the microbiota, so consisting of trillions of microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, viruses, parasites. I know that some of those might sound awful, but really when they're all in kind of balance, they can coexist very happily together. And so kind of thinking of the microbiome as like a forest, we want, the trees and the bushes and the insects and the different animals, we want that diversity. So everyone's microbiome is unique. And I think this is a really important piece because it doesn't mean that there's kind of one perfect microbiome. Everyone is going to be unique, and the key is we want diversity. And unfortunately, a lot of environmental exposures, such as long-duration antibiotics, stress, diet, can really impact that microbiome, and it can impact that diversity. It can change the bacteria that's in there, and that particular profile of the microbiome. So if we think about the connection between our gut and inflammation, so the gut, gut is amazing with all the things that it does, and we're only on the surface of the research into the gut and everything that it does and the roles that it plays, but it does contain pro and anti-inflammatory microbes in there. And so like I mentioned, when the microbiome is challenged with certain stressors, like a chronic consumption of highly processed sugar foods, or again, a long duration course of antibiotics, can create that state of dysbiosis, and this can increase those pro-inflammatory microbes. So having this kind of state of dysbiosis can lead to increased intestinal permeability. And if we think back to what when we're talking about that inflammation pathway and how the release of histamine, for example, can impact the blood vessel dilation and expanded, and also make the cells a little bit leakier so things can get through. So if this is happening in the gut, there's a little bit of that increased intestinal permeability. Things are kind of leaking through. So inflammation in the gut impacts that pro-inflammatory response. It's releasing those cell signaling molecules and neurotransmitters, and sending off, which will then kind of cascade into a bit of a pro-inflammatory response when the gut's really stressed and challenged like that. So inflammation can impact the microbiome, like you mentioned, releasing some of these chemicals such as the histamines, dilating those blood vessels, becoming leakier. Roughly, 70% of the immune function is along our digestive tract. And it's a very close link between our gut and the gut brain, kind of called the gut brain axis, kind of chatting back and forth. So when we have more beneficial gut bacteria, it leads to communication with the immune system to support lowering a lower inflammatory response. And then, of course, conversely, if there's more of the pro-inflammatory bacteria, it's going to be communicating with the immune system to send out a pro-inflammatory response. So if our blood vessels are becoming a bit leakier, some unwanted components can kind of seep through cell walls. And then when these components that are supposed to stay in the gut get out and go somewhere else, then this can cause inflammation. So it ends up being a little bit of this kind of negative or a detrimental feedback loop, because we have some inflammation, but then inflammation, the process to try and solve it ends up causing some of these materials to leave, and then we have to mount another inflammatory response to try and support the body with these materials that shouldn't be there, and then it kind of goes round a little bit. So if we think about how diet affects the microbiome, again, a lot of these things are very similar with the nutrition for inflammation that we chatted about. So really high saturated fat, high added sugars tend to create some of these negative changes. And I will say also, it's chronic consumption of those foods without the other foods. So there's absolutely, we're going to have some saturated fat in our diet, and we want that. We still need some saturated fat. It's a chronic consumption of very high saturated fat or very high added sugar, refined foods, quite processed, that can create some of these negative changes. So on the flip side, high fiber diets increase favorable species. Plant foods are associated with improved diversity and resilience in that microbiome. But one thing I find so fascinating, so the gut microbiome, it can begin to change in as little as 24 hours in response to dietary changes. And I think this is just so amazing, especially when I'm working with somebody and maybe they're seeing inflammation present in terms of whether it's skin, eczema, and things like that. And with some major dietary changes, you can see sometimes some shifts in that. And it's pretty neat because you can tell that things are shifting in there. And then as that gut microbiome begins to change, other kind of side effects begin to change with that. So I always find that pretty neat. So for thinking about nutrition strategies to support the gut and to support that microbiome, the big thing is we really want to diversify our gut health. So probiotics, and again, we can absolutely get these from food forms. So probiotics are the healthy or good bacteria that help kind of maintain balance in along our GI tract and in the colon. So some examples are yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, miso, tempeh. And I think there was a question or comment earlier about dairy. Yes, conflicting stories about dairy. Yeah, so I know one question I often get a lot is, well, I want to have some probiotics, but I don't, maybe it's a person who doesn't eat much dairy. And dairy is an interesting thing. I think when I'm working with someone around dairy, it usually requires quite a kind of conversation of weighing things out. So for some people, dairy is providing a great source, of course, of calcium and vitamin D and B vitamins and a lot of nutrients, and it's a protein source. And if protein's important if they're not getting it from a lot of other sources, it can be really helpful for that. Same with things like Greek yogurt. Some dairy is higher in saturated fat, and that's where, they can often be a bit confusing because that's linked with inflammation. So it really depends on how much someone's having of something like that and the purpose that it's playing in their body. Yeah. So, the comment about love yogurt, but it makes my throat foamy. So not sure if intolerance should be pushed through to get the benefits of the probiotic. Yes. So I think that's a really great point. And that's so important, that individual insight. So if you're finding you're not responding well to something, that's where looking at these other options. So I put, so we have the sauerkraut, miso, and tempeh, but I put yogu here. And I also don't have much dairy simply because I just found it hasn't been very supportive with my stomach and feel a bit upset after it. But yogu is a coconut-based, I guess, yogurt, you could call it, that has wonderful strains of probiotics in it. It's a Vancouver-based company. You can get it at places like Root Cellar. And I find this is a great alternative for somebody who finds yogurt doesn't sit well with them, but are still trying to get an easy source of probiotics from food. So yogu is an option there. It's the only challenge is it's not cheap. I think it's about $8 or $9 for a jar. But it's I just find it's a really nice alternative. And I know sometimes telling someone to eat sauerkraut to get probiotics would be a tough sell. So yogu, and it's delicious. And like I said, it's a really great company as well. And then, like I mentioned, there are probiotic supplements, but encourage talking to a health professional before starting one, simply because sometimes probiotics get thrown around as a bit of like a catch-all. Well, just take a probiotic, but it want it to be with a purpose. So is it somebody who's having some digestive issues? Do we want the probiotic or is it to support with that? Did they just come off a course of antibiotics and we need to kind of diversify that gut bacteria again? So these are all things to kind of consider. But if we're just taking one for the sake of taking one, that too can alter our gut microbiome. So we just want to make sure that it's kind of for a purpose and it's meeting the needs of why we're trying to take it, because there's going to be different probiotics that support different things like irritable bowel, like IBS and irritable bowel disease and different things like that. And like I mentioned with antibiotics or things like diarrhea, there's different purposes for different probiotic strains.
Hey, Alison.
Yeah.
I noticed that many of those are fermented foods. So do you have any insights into what the fermenting process does to the foods that can be positive for our microbiome?
Yeah, that's a great question. And basically we're with that live bacteria. So with the purpose of fermentation and starting that, and where I still get a bit confused is because not everything that's fermented is a probiotic. So a lot certainly are, and that process helps with that kind of live bacteria. And then that's, is what's in the food. So that's why a lot of fermented foods are included there. So beyond kind of the fermentation to support with that live bacteria and that growth in that particular process, that's where it plays a role into why a lot of these foods are really supportive for having those live bacteria strains in there. Does that
yeah,
help?
great, thank you.
All right. So other nutrition strategies. So we talked about probiotics and that great gut bacteria, but we want to feed that bacteria. So this is where prebiotics come in. So these are going to be non-digestible carbohydrates. So a lot of high fiber foods. And these are the particular fibers, the fructo oligosaccharides or fructones, galacto oligosaccharides, and these can be found in foods like asparagus, bananas, garlic, Jerusalem, artichoke, leeks, onion, tomatoes, whole grains. And I feel like another question that often comes up is, what if I am doing like FODMAP, or somebody who FODMAP is like a particular kind of diet way of eating that some people will do to try and help relieve certain gut issues. And a lot of these foods certainly are high in those. And that's where, and again, it's through a lot of conversation with someone, but you can start by incorporating them in slowly, and often end up being really supportive for people, and getting, again, because we can kind of train the gut, and it adapts. So if somebody goes from having no fiber foods in their diet, and then all of a sudden they start having a lot of fiber, yeah, they probably will feel some bloating. They're going to feel a little bit of that, because that's those gut bacteria, and they're doing their job, breaking things down, fermenting, bubbles, all those types of things. But the gut does adapt, and certainly adapts with including a lot of these wonderful foods, and really does help diversify that gut bacteria. And as it gets more diverse, you can end up tolerating a lot of those foods even better. And then we talked about, of course, anti-inflammatory foods, but incorporating those will, of course, support the gut. So we can really see that it's a back and forth, there's no chicken and the egg with that. It's kind of like a loop about which one comes first. But wanting to have those anti-inflammatory foods help reduce both the inflammation in the gut and just encourage that release of those anti-inflammatory molecules. So we talked about a lot of anti-inflammatory foods, but those bright colored fruits and vegetables, the berries and the sweet potatoes, the high fiber foods with beans and legumes and whole grains, the omega-3 fatty acids, of course, we've talked about, and spices as well, we've mentioned. And then also supportive of the gut, and similar with supporting inflammations, that balanced meals and snacks, because this will help with that blood sugar management. So I like to think of incorporating protein, fiber, and fat together. So we've got some protein to help kind of level out blood sugar rises, fiber, so really complex, high fiber carbohydrate foods, and some fat as well, especially those kind of omega-3 fats in there, just to help with balancing blood sugar management. And this will also be really supportive for energy levels. Okay, so like I mentioned, I wanted some really kind of practical tips for you guys about how we can sort of add in some of these foods. So with regards to diversifying and feeding the bacteria in the gut, absolutely fiber. We want to make sure we're getting some fiber, aiming for 25 to 40 grams upwards per day. So like I mentioned, trying a fermented food, yes, to help with that gut bacteria. The yogu, of course, is still as well. So miso, sauerkraut, tempeh, those are some nice options of those kind of fermented foods. Adding ground flax onto an oatmeal or cereal at breakfast. Ground flax is also going to have a lot of those great kind of plant-based chemicals in there, those phytoestrogens in the flax, has a lot of positive health benefits. So adding ground flax onto your oatmeal or adding it into cereal, berries or hemp hearts on top of yogurt. So thinking a little bit about what you might have for breakfast, and is there a way that you could boost that fiber on that breakfast item? If you're looking for an afternoon snack, seeing if you can have incorporating like some hummus with the chickpeas, a really great fiber boost with some veggies, adding in beans and lentils in any place you get. And I'll be the first to admit, I'm still not a huge bean fan. As a dietitian, I feel like I almost have to be. But so black bean brownies, I feel like are a fantastic way of fitting in black beans, and they're absolutely delicious. And black beans are the base of them. So really high fiber brownies. And there's a really good recipe from Minimalist Baker on black bean brownies. So if you're like me and struggle with getting beans in, I encourage you to check that one out. If you're getting a bread, look for a whole grain or a sprouted grain bread. That will have a much higher fiber content. And just kind of a general rule in terms of, is this a good fiber source or not? Usually look for 4 grams of fiber or more per serving. So if you're looking at granola bars or crackers or rice or pasta or any of those kind of carbohydrate foods, if there's 4 grams or more of fiber per serving, they've usually left a fair amount of kind of the food intact. It hasn't been totally stripped down and processed where now there's no fiber left, and is a good indication that at least you're getting a good little bump of fiber in that. All right. And then increasing that ratio of omega-3 rich foods. So what might that look like? Are you able to incorporate fish a couple times a week, such as salmon? Could you add some spinach if you're having a smoothie, or saute some leafy greens with dinner? Adding in ground flax and chia seeds, walnuts and hemp hearts. And this is a great way of making a homemade protein powder. So I'll blend up the flax and the chia and the hemp hearts, some nuts, add in maybe some cocoa powder if you want a chocolate one, or there's that it's called PB2, which is like a powdered peanut butter. And I just find, because I wouldn't be able to use the wet peanut butter in terms of for it keeping and not going bad, but blending those up, adding in some pumpkin seeds, blending that up too, can make a really nice homemade protein powder. And so if you're looking for a recipe, feel free to email me and I'll send you the one that I make. And it's a nice way of getting a boost of protein, but also getting some really great fiber. And then it's an option if you don't want, if you're not having like a supplement or something like that. It's a really nice one to use. Or try a chia seed pudding. And I've got a recipe I'll show on the next slide. And then we'll also just mention, again, incorporating those fruits and vegetables for that variety of nutrients. So here's just an example of chia seed pudding. I find, again, a really nice afternoon snack. Again, those chia seeds, great source of those omega-3s, great source of fiber, plant-based protein. Could use either a cup of milk or unsweetened plant-based beverage. You can play around with the different flavors. I like going peanut butter and cocoa powder. You could certainly go fruit, berries, a little vanilla. Can blend in a few dates in there, or a little bit of maple syrup or some banana. Lots of recipe ideas for chia seed pudding, Minimalist Baker and Cookie and Kate. So I just put those there too as some ideas, but I find these are also a really great grab and go option, especially for when you're on the run. And then, balancing those meals and snacks with fiber, protein, and fats. So if you're having, especially something like a smoothie that's being blended up, and we're going to absorb it a lot faster, and it kind of causes that rise in blood sugar. So making sure we've got a good protein source in the smoothie. Again, nuts, seed, nut butter, Greek yogurt, tofu is great to be blended in. Sometimes I'll even blend in a 1/4 cup of chickpeas or something like that to boost it a little bit. Just to help, again, slow down that blood sugar release, help with balancing those blood sugars. If you're having a soup, again, blending in some cashews. Tofu can also be blended into soup for some protein. Salads, if there's a way to add on top some nuts and seeds or roasted chickpeas. And just thinking with kind of that balanced dinner plate, trying to get half of the fruit and veggies, 1/4 with that really great complex carbohydrate food, and then 1/4 of the protein. So thinking a little bit of kind of that plate model can sometimes help. And then if you're having a snack, I know I do this all the time, we'll grab a quick piece of fruit, but see if you can pair it with a little bit of protein and fat, some almonds, or some peanut butter with fruit is a great option, or a handful of seeds, pumpkin seeds or something, just again, to help slow down any kind of quick absorption of carbohydrates and slow down that blood sugar rise. All right, so I want to make sure I leave a few minutes for questions, but just some key takeaways. So again, inflammation is a normal and healthy physiological response. Where it gets problematic is if it becomes quite chronic, and then making sure we take the time to figure out what can lead to that chronic inflammation and how to support the body with kind of going back to an anti-inflammatory state. So we want to promote an anti-inflammatory environment in the body and reduce those pro-inflammatory influences. We talked about how our gut and inflammation are really closely linked, and how supporting our gut will in turn encourage anti-inflammatory environment in the body. And then I hope you got some kind of practical strategies and ideas for how to incorporate some of those foods into your diet and everyday eating pattern. All right, so make sure we get some questions. So I'm just going to pull that chat back up and look at these. So yeah, I know the first one that came in. So conflicting stories about dairy and gluten. I know we talked about dairy a little bit. Gluten, again, it really comes to an individual kind of conversation with somebody about that. So if they're finding that they're having a lot of sort of inflammatory type responses. So are they noticing changes in their skin? Is it presenting in redness and rosacea or eczema, or is there digestive issues with it? Then some people do find it supportive to remove something like that. But in terms of a general statement about gluten causing inflammation, that's where I'd be hesitant to go that far. I'd look at, is it because the gluten's in maybe high glycemic carbohydrates, or is it replacing kind of those particular gluten foods? Are they replacing other foods? And just try and figure out what it is. But I don't think it's fair as a blanket statement that gluten would directly cause inflammation. But with that being said, a lot of people end up kind of if they're presenting with signs of inflammation, do see some benefits with trialing removal to see if that helps. There's a question about sensitivities and intolerances diminish or increase over time. Yeah, so this is such a great question. And I would say, yes, they can absolutely change over time. So one example is if somebody goes a long period of time without having any dairy, or even just as people age, sometimes this changes. The enzyme that helps break down the lactase in our body, that can change. So all of a sudden, somebody maybe could tolerate dairy their whole life, and now has a cup of milk and is starting to find that they just can't tolerate it anymore, and kind of build up an intolerance because that enzyme's changed and now no longer can break the lactase down as well. And that's also why some dairy foods are more problematic than others because of that lactose content. So that's an example of one that changes. And then also, because inflammation is so linked to some of those other factors like stress, this is where I really see a lot of food sensitivities and intolerances changing. If somebody's high stress, that in combination with foods can kind of create these big flare-ups. And often when they deal with the stress and get that under control, they can usually tolerate a lot more foods that they thought maybe they were sensitive to and now don't appear to be. So yeah, again, it's something that comes through a lot of conversation with somebody, but absolutely, I've seen them change and shift over time, can definitely change, and especially with some of those other factors that come into play. And then I'm going to put her name for the dietitian. Diabetic to dietetic is, I think, she's the dietitian who, would be able to speak that a lot better than I would. And she's got a great website and a good Instagram as well. So hopefully you can connect with her, and I'll also let her know. We talked about the red meat one, yogurt. Yeah. Check it out in Kelowna. Comments on intermittent fasting. In what context? Do you have a bit more context on it? Are you talking in regards to like inflammation, generally speaking, or for weight loss? Yeah, it's a loaded question. I think it's in terms of just generally with weight loss, it really depend on so many things. And I guess there is some research to support that it can help a lot of processes in the body that may also contribute to weight loss. It's can be challenging to tease out if that's due to overall changes in calories. But I would just say, just be careful. A lot of the research is on males of certain ages. So for females, for example, they can have a lot of, it can kind of wreak havoc a little bit with hormones, and certainly if the research isn't kind of totally complete with all different types of people, it's tough to know how people respond to it. And so I have seen it be a bit challenging for some women, and it actually increased cortisol, and it increased quite a high kind of stress response with the intermittent fasting. So there's a lot of factors that would come into play. So I don't have kind of a straightforward answer with it. It really, there has to be kind of a weighing out of a lot of pros and cons, a lot of risks and benefits to see if it would be right for somebody and in the context of weight loss. Yeah, it's a great question. Any other questions or any that I missed or didn't answer?
There's quite a lot of anecdotal stuff out there, hey, Alison, around the intermittent fasting. I know I do it myself, and I'm by no means an expert, but anecdotally, I can say it's really helped me, just helping process during the day and just go about my work, right?
Yeah, and that's where it's so interesting how it's such an individual thing and people respond to it so differently. And again, the research is really interesting how it is primarily with males, and my husband also, he does it just naturally, and it's so easy for him. And I know, and again, this would be an anecdotal thing with myself, but it made it quite stressful for me, and that kind of prolonged period of time, and I didn't get the same kind of like brain clarity that people talk about. And it also really impacted just a lot of kind of hormones and hormone regulation with this prolonged window. And it's all just to say that everyone is an individual and is going to respond differently. And so has to really kind of weigh out everything for a particular person, I think. Yeah, just with the particular approach. And like you said, works great for some people. And then I think there's some caution with others as well.
Yeah, I think us being able to discuss these things, I think makes it beneficial for everybody, because there's awareness out there now that there can be a lot of variation and a lot of factors to consider. Because if you skip breakfast, back in the day, it was shocking if you skip breakfast. That is the most important meal of the day. So I think it's just great that everybody can have the conversations now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's also some research to show that, and I'm drawing a blank on the name, something to do with timing windows, but to actually shift it. And so if somebody was going to do it, to actually have their window in the evening where they're fasting, but to have a breakfast and a lunch, and then that window later. But I think also in the context of just what like typical eating patterns and the impact that could have on our social eating habits as well. A lot of times research doesn't take those things into context. And yeah, so just a lot of factors for sure.
Alison, I just want to say thank you so much for the past 2 weeks. This has been phenomenal. Both as a coach and an athlete, just hearing things again, because just your tips that you're giving on, helping your gut bacteria. I'm like, oh yeah, that's why I do that. That's why I have the chia and the flax and the hemp and the walnuts around. Like, I just thought about that yesterday, because I'm like, why do I have these walnuts here? I haven't been using them lately. So thank you so much.
Well,
for
thank
sharing
you.
your passion, obviously, but also your knowledge with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, it means a lot. I really appreciate it. Appreciate everybody attending.
Alison, I applaud you for cramming so much in to an hour, and also breaking it down, because that's some real technological and biochemistry stuff there. So I appreciate you breaking it down for us.
Oh, well, hope I did it justice. But yeah, I really hope that got some learning and also just really got some great practical tips to take away. But always please reach out anytime if you do have any follow-up questions that come to mind. I'm always happy to chat and answer them at any time. So please do reach out if you wish.
Okay, great. Well, if there's no more questions, I think we'll wrap up tonight. I just want to say thank you everybody for tuning in. This was the final part in our nutrition series for this time around. We've got a few things that we're planning right now, but I see there's some sport health professionals and coaches and athletes on tonight's call and last week. So if there's something you want to see that you feel like you want to know about or something that's missing in the community, let us know. Or alternatively, if you want to speak at one of these events, please let's start the dialogue. We are passionate about getting local people involved. And we want to just continue this education for the sporting public. So with that being said, thank you again. If you've got any more interest in the Pacific Sport programs, please reach out. My name is Kevin Lindo. My email is klindo@pacificsport.com. And you can catch us on pacificsportvi.com and at pacificsportvi on all our social media handles too. This will be on our YouTube channel, among other things that we've done in the last few years, including shows with Alison. So Alison, thank you so much again, and good night, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye.